Elections were the first non-racial national elections where everyone over the age of 18 from any race group, including foreign citizens permanently residing in South Africa, was allowed to vote. Previously, as you can recall, under the apartheid regime, non-whites had only limited rights to vote. To discuss the political transformation since 1994, we are joined from our Pretoria studios by political analyst, Professor Lesiba Tefo. He's the head of Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA. Very good morning to you, Professor, as well as political analyst Sanusha Naidu, who is joining us from our Cape Town studio. Sanusha, very good morning to you.
Good morning as well. Thank you.
Professor Tefo, let's start off with you. Take us back and tell us how different are our political issues today compared to before 1994.
The temptation is very strong to try to accentuate the challenges that we are faced with. But there is so much to celebrate. So much has been achieved in the past 23 years. And I could just mention a few, for example, just simple things like arts and culture. I think we are at a stage where we can say, indeed, we won the World Cup. We won, we hosted the World Cup, and then we won the AFCON, we won the rugby, and there is integration, not necessarily cohesion. More blacks and whites are living together in the estates. They are together in the schools. What we need to work on is cohesion. Indeed, there are more people today who are getting financial assistance to enable them to live while they are looking for meaningful and sustainable jobs. Call them grants, but I think it's something commendable. Equally, there are more people in the classroom today than it was the case yesteryear. Though the quality of education is something else, comparatively speaking, deplorable. But at least there are a number of people who have access to that. And let's talk infrastructure, and that will be, for now, the last point. The infrastructure has improved a lot. And I think we attribute that to some extent to us hosting the World Cup. So for now, I say there is so much to celebrate, so much to be thankful. But the hopes encapsulated in the national flag that was hosted on that fateful day, on the 27th of April, right, 1994, are withering away. The hopes are being dashed. The hopes are being deferred. And we need to regroup. And we need to ensure that the Founding Fathers' aspirations, the Founding Fathers' sacrifices were indeed not in vain.
Sanusha, from your perspective, is today's political reality exactly what South Africans voted for back in 1994? Your perspective?
It's difficult, Elvis, to say that. I mean, I think generally speaking, when people voted in 94, there was a lot of euphoria around what the expectation was in terms of what the vote signified for many disenfranchised individuals who were eventually given the right to vote. And so in that context, I think the idea of voting was much more than just going out to cast a ballot. It signified a whole lot of things for individuals, as you see in the snaking cues that your inserts are showing throughout the morning. And that is, people were voting for very real socioeconomic issues. They were voting for very real views in terms of using the ballot as a way in which they saw it as improving their livelihoods, their lifestyle, their economic, their material status in society. It was very, very significant, not just in the context of having the vote, but also what it materially meant to them in terms of improving their so-called existence within society. So I think in that context, it was the merging of those two expectations. One, getting the right to vote, which was really, really important, but at the same time, what that right meant in terms of the significance of casting the ballot. And the significance of that was really around how would this become a materially important set of rights that would improve our livelihoods, improve the way our so-called existence within a post-apartheid South Africa would actually be much more meaningful than it was under apartheid.
Now, Professor, we're asking our viewers today whether or not they think they are free, and we'd like to check with you, how would one define political freedom? And after 23 years of democracy, has South Africa achieved that political freedom and that we search for and attained?
Look, liberal values that we fought for, in and by themselves, are not enough. It was Mwalimu Julius Nyerere who said, people live on bread, not on slogans. Values are necessary, and ideals we should strive for. But if you say to me, since 1994, have your material conditions changed? And I'm in a rural village in the furthest corner of Limpopo or Northwest, and I say no to you, you might have to work hard to convince me. And indeed, there are those who would say, the circumstances in Northwest, right? The circumstances under Mangope were far different and better than they are today. There are those, and the number of those people, incidentally, is growing in number amidst the learned, the middle class, and even the highly educated, who are regretting finding themselves in the circumstance, who are regretting having condemned uncritically the leadership of the homeland leaders. So the material conditions for others have not changed, and the number of those is growing. And it is that is worrying me, unless we arrest the trend that make people uneasy and unhappy. Unemployment, the quality of education, the quality of public service. I know for a fact that if you went to the hospital or to a clinic, you would get quality service 20 years ago. On human, at personal level, and also in terms of provision of the necessities than one expected when one went to the hospital. Is that the case today? Unfortunately, it's not enough to say we are living in a democratic dispensation when the material conditions are not far at all better, or if anything, are worse than they were prior to 1994. It may sound too strong, but that is a reality. And go down into the villages, and even in the cities, we'll find those who share the same sentiment with me. And I'm saying, if I were a politician, I would be more worried. And there is evidence that people are beginning to be more worried and are moving away to those that thought they were their liberators, imbued with the public spirit, those who are supposed to be public spirited and be about the other and not the self.
Talking about those material conditions, Ms. Naidu, South Africans are able to vote, so we have political power, but radical economic freedom seems to be still a very distant reality in our lifetime. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, we do see a lot of inequities around the whole question of distribution of wealth or access to resources and so forth. And I think Professor Tefo has raised very, very critical points about the quality of your economic freedom and the quality of access to resources, in particular your utilities and so forth. Interspersed with that is the whole issue about the question of money that's supposed to be effectively rolled out to improve this access to resource, but more importantly, improve the quality. And there we see a lot of the disjuncture, a lot of the fragmentation around the fact that we may be able to go, there's a level of structural issues in terms of how people actually access these resources. So we see the constant social service protests that happen on a continuous basis. Just this week, we've seen them turn even more violent than previously. And these are the kinds of frustrations that become demonstrated through the lack of the quality of the service that's being provided. And at the same time, when you see the kinds of excesses that are taking place in the public sector, within government departments, within certain institutions of the state, where there's a sense of saying, well, people are just exploiting and manipulating the resources for personal or self-gain, but not really translating that into how to improve people's economic freedom, economic access to resources. So that's the one level. And then, of course, the second level is the whole question around ownership of resources, ownership of the way in which the JSE is constructed. And there's another debate happening there in terms of whether or not that economic transformation is taking place. So we're having different levels and different layers of economic transformation expressing themselves both in a negative and of course in the questions that are being raised around the economic governance of the country. So the political right to vote is interesting, but if you can't use that to improve your material standards, or it's not being used to improve people's material standards, then it creates that contradiction within the democratic structure.
Now, Professor, you touched on it a little bit earlier. We've witnessed over the years many protests relating to service delivery, as well as basic services such as water and ablution facilities. What does this tell us about our economic freedom that we are searching for?
Yes, the people are saying to us that indeed there are challenges. We accept that. But it is this inequality and rampant consumption and ostentatious consumption and display of wealth that worsen the tension that there is. Economic transformation, as my colleague Sanusha said, if it can translate in changing the material condition of the people, is of no consequence. This is corruption that leads people to lose faith in the government of the day. And it is this corruption that in turn lead people to begin to regroup and say, it is within us and it is in our hands to change our lot. Hence you are seeing now the emergence of movements not dissimilar to what looked like the UDF and others, who are saying we must arrest this trend. Mm-hmm. And we must ensure that the country doesn't go to the docks. It doesn't become one of the failed states. And it is within us. Hence today you have Save South Africa. You have now a new movement that is being launched today in Pretoria. All these are patriots who are concerned with the future of the country, with the direction the country is taking. And they are saying it behoves them to change their lot, to change the direction. In the same way, there was a generation of leaders under Mandela and others who said apartheid must be arrested and something must replace it. And there are those who are saying, and I'm one of those, the current system must be changed. Something new must give way, must give birth, and then in turn, those that take the reins of power must ensure that they don't repeat the sins of incumbency that led to the demise of apartheid, perhaps even the demise of the current leadership or the ruling party.
Johan Benjamin says on the Facebook page, freedom means nothing without economic freedom because we are landless. Sanusha, how does that tie in with the radical economic transformation? We've also seen the change of guard at Treasury in a midnight cabinet reshuffle. Is that perhaps the start to achieve radical economic transformation?
Radical economic transformation, I think, we've got to be very careful and cautious in how we use terminology like that in order to try and justify particular decisions that are being made. Transformation is important, whether it's radical or not radical, whether it takes place in a context of actually distributing equitably the resources of the country. And I think what's very important is that ownership of resources are critical to the way in which people may feel that their economic rights actually have some value to it. Now, when you start using terms like radical economic transformation, I think you then end up in a situation where you're trying to actually talk about a context where you're saying, well, it hasn't happened. But it has always, economic transformation has always been part of the so-called economic negotiations and the political transition and the economic transition of 94. That has been the discussion in both CODESA 1, CODESA 2. It has been part of the transitional negotiations, etc. The challenge we have is that we haven't systemically put into place those mechanisms in order to provide for the economic transformation. So I'm a bit confused when people start talking about radical economic transformation, because in my mind, economic transformation is supposed to take place in a manner which is equitably distributing the resources. We keep hearing this reference to radical, but radical in a sense gives it all different kinds of imagery and connotation which can actually have negative impacts around this. So the cabinet reshuffle, as well as the fact that we still are talking about the redistribution of land and the ownership of land issues and so forth, is still very much part of the national dialogue. But it hasn't been seen to be moving forward, because if you go back and you look at legislation and you look at the way in which legislation has been developed and the architecture of the legislation, it's still very much linked to a kind of market-related approach to some of these questions. So again, I would be very, very careful in saying that we are now embarking on radical economic transformation, when in fact this has always been part, economic transformation has always been part of the agenda of South Africa's transition since '94. That was what the whole process was about. And this is where I think the disjuncture and the kind of contradiction comes in when you say, well, we've got the political, but we haven't really done the economic. This was supposed to happen. This was what you were supposed to have achieved. You were supposed to actually give people quality services. You're supposed to be able to provide the houses, provide the water and sanitation, provide the kinds of social services, etc., to people, because that was the whole essence of the political negotiations and the transition. But unfortunately, I think what we've seen in South Africa is also the question of corruption, the question of the different ways in which resources have been manipulated, and what that has now led to in terms of how people are trying to pull it back by saying, oh, now we're going on to a radical economic transformation agenda, when in fact it's really around the manipulation of resources, the exploitation of resources, and this massive disjuncture between people who have access to resources and those that don't, but the inequality that has set in. And what that does is that it gives people very little confidence in terms of whether or not we're going to achieve the kinds of issues that we said we were going to achieve during the '94 democratic process and before that in the negotiations.
Now, Professor, I was going to ask you the same question in relation to radical economic transformation, but we don't have much time, so let me go to my final question to you. Increased racial tensions, marginalizations of minority groups, contestation of resources and land, but just some of the issues and the lingering problems that are still unresolved in the country. Does this prove that we still have unresolved freedoms that have not been realized, you would think?
Well, there is a lot still to be done. In as much as in my introduction I mentioned what I consider milestones, but a lot still to be done. By the way, the struggle was not for air-conditioned offices. The struggle was for the land. When you have the land, you have all else. The land is about history, it's about identity, it's about heritage. The land belongs to the dead, the living, and posterity. So it is all what we are about. So there is still a lot to be done. But let me just touch on this radical economic transformation. There is a cliche that goes, a white minority capital. I have a retort for that, right? Black minority elite. You talk radical economic transformation for the benefit of the limited few, the politically connected and networked. And that's why, therefore, you'll find that, yes, there has been a tremendous improvement to the benefit of the few and not the majority. And the majority now are getting restless and are turning against their own. If you have read Animal Farm by George Orwell, that's exactly what is transpiring right now. There is a lot to be done, and I would hope that the political leadership will regroup and ensure that it is not too late. As one would state that 2019 might not necessarily put a smile on the face of the ruling party unless they smell the coffee immediately.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Sanusha, for joining us in our Cape Town studio as well as in our Pretoria studios.
Thank you.
That was the Professor Lesiba Tefo. He's the head of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA, as well as Sanusha Naidu. She is a political analyst joining us from our Cape Town studios. Now, you can also join us at the top of the hour, because right now we're going to take a short break and we'll be back at 10 o'clock. Stay tuned.